As I said, the Global South aspirations are covered from an industry perspective as well.
Namaskar and welcome to In Conversation. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. India's G20 presidency marked many historic milestones, from inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of the grouping to the consensus-driven, ambitious New Delhi Declaration. It paves a roadmap for inclusive, sustainable and accelerated development. And to talk about the key achievement of India's G20 leadership presidency, I have with me a very special guest, Mr. R Dinesh, President, Confederation of Indian Industry, CII. Welcome to DD India, sir.
Thank you.
So let's first talk about the big takeaways of India's G20 presidency. What would they be, especially for the industry?
No, I think first I would start by saying big congratulations and a thanks to the Honorable Prime Minister, because I think what has been achieved in this G20 is something which is unprecedented from the coverage of it. So if I look at it, first and foremost, I think his focus on Sabke Saath was, making sure that we had the Africa Union becoming part of the G20, which itself is, I think, one of the biggest takeaways. But I think equally important is the focus in terms of making sure the Global South aspirations are well covered. Second is in terms of the inclusive approach, which I think has been also part of the One Family, One Earth future, which has been the focus of India. And last but not the least, I would say is making sure that the private sector and the industry gets involved in this endeavor in very many ways.
Right. We understand that one of the very important groupings within G20, the B20, was headed by the CII. The communique that you presented, the recommendations that you presented, how satisfied are you with what has been reflected in the final declaration?
I would say more than delighted, because actually whatever we have talked about have resonated very well with what has been mentioned from in the G20 declaration. First and foremost is on the sustainability, financing for sustainable growth. Second is in terms of making sure we have the MSMEs included. And equally important is to make sure that, as I said, the Global South aspirations are covered from an industry perspective as well. So I think if I look at each of these focus areas for us as B20, I think the G20 has taken cognizance of that in terms of making sure they get covered, not just for the benefit of industry, but for the benefit of humanity as a whole.
Right. And so from the industry perspective, the strengthening of the voice of the Global South, inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member, what are the implications of it?
So first and foremost, I think, like I said, it takes care of, takes into account the aspirations of the largest part of the population of Africa. And we're talking about 1.4 billion, if I remember right. So if you add that to the fact that we already have a significant set of, I would call it, developing countries which are part of G20, and therefore they get integrated into that aspiration. Second, from an economic point of view, let us not forget that this also throws open great opportunities. And along with that, you also saw the India, Middle East, Africa corridor being talked about. And this again throws open huge opportunities for both a private sector and also the way in which governments within these countries will operate to facilitate that, to make it happen.
Right. And if you talk about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership of India's presidency, the manner in which he had to navigate through complex economic and geopolitical issues through the G20, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I can only say it's been brilliant. It's maybe I would call it the pinnacle of achievement in terms of making this happen. Like I said, each of these steps are path-breaking. And to make sure that we have full consensus across the board, not only from the developing countries, but most importantly from the developed countries, to be able to understand the reasons as to why these are being brought about. And the focus on the One Earth, One Family is, I think, something which I think has really resonated well. And I think we have to congratulate him and thank him for taking the leadership in making this happen, because otherwise there is no other way. I think all of these would have happened coming together. And as you saw in some of the press coverage as well, you heard that ultimately his name had to be used to make sure that people came across to make that happen.
In fact, just before the Leaders Summit, in his Mann Ki Baat address, Prime Minister also spoke about the journey of G20 in the country, the manner in which over 220 meetings took place across 60 locations. And it had many positive cascading impact also. The idea of vocal for local products got a global platform. Tourism saw a great spike in places across the country. What are your reflections on the manner also, the journey of G20 through the year?
I think it was a brilliant move, and for many reasons. There was some of ones which you mentioned, but I think even more importantly was, I would say, to help showcase India and the brand of what I would call what India really stands for, which I think people don't normally get exposed to, whether it be government visitors or it be business visitors. So the fact that they got exposed to all of these, I would call it different facets of India, and also help showcase the infrastructure development which has taken place in the country, I think that was the first development. The second was the fact that it got the whole, I would call it, India excited about the outcome. And I think the outcome has more than, I would call it, exceeded the excitement. Therefore, those two are, I think, the first big takeaways. The second, I would call it the corollary benefits, has been the fact that both from an investment perspective and in a future ability for people to understand India better and come in for future investments is also being created, or a platform has been created for that.
And Mr. Dinesh, how do you diagnose the key challenges faced by the global economy today, and how successfully has India's presidency been able to take a look at it and also provide remedies for it?
So if I step back and look at it, India's presidency has come at a time when the whole world was coming out of COVID. And I think India's way in which it handled the coming out of COVID had been significantly different from many of the other developed countries. And I think today facts prove that maybe India's handling was kind of helped India today become the fastest growing economy. So I think the fact that the presidency came with a proof of delivery, I think, was itself a first plus point. The second was, like we spoke about, making sure that this growth is possible, but at the same time making sure it's sustainable. Two is in terms of making sure it's inclusive. Third is in terms of, inclusive, it's not just including Africa, but also the fact that the requirements of the, I would call it, the lesser privileged populations of the global south are fully taken care of and kind of counted into the planning for the future, is something which I think has been path-breaking.
Right, and in fact, through the year, we saw how the deliberations also focused on the need to reform and reimagine global supply chains and in a sustainable manner going forward. What would be India's role in it, as far as the declaration is concerned?
I would call it substantial. And like I mentioned, the fact that there cannot be global value chains without India being part of it is something which I think from a B20 perspective, we did come out as a very strong recommendation. And I think the reality is that building trust is a very important part, which I think the Honorable Prime Minister had been working on.
Yeah, he spoke about how the trust deficit is at the center of the problems of the world.
Exactly. So I think for me, that I think is the biggest, I would call it, takeaway, as the psychological fact that countries have to start trusting global value chains. And if they are to do that, there has to be a few countries which stand up and say that we are the ones to be trusted. And I think India has taken the lead that under the Honorable Prime Minister's leadership, and that's something which I think will help benefit not just India as a country, but also the industry which are associated, and help create an opportunity for the companies to become part of the global value chains.
And this idea, what kind of opportunity and also responsibility does it then present to the private sector in India going forward?
Obviously the two words which we use, making sure that they become trusted partners into global value chains, and making sure that we are competitive, making sure that we are doing it in a sustainable manner, and last but not the least, again, walking the talk in terms of making sure we are inclusive in the way we approach it. And their inclusion is also going to be about gender diversity, is also going to be making sure that we take care of the planet and all the requirements in a sustainable manner.
And talking about planet, we know that climate crisis really prevailed through all conversations at the G20. The vision of one Earth, one family, one future. How's the industry looking at the manner in which it would play a key role? I mean, particular interventions that we can hope from them.
So if I look at actually the theme of CII for this year, I think there were two elements which actually speak about that. We said that we would make sure that we have sustainable growth, make sure that we build trust. And this was not just trust between industry to government, but also industry dealing with all its stakeholders. So I think it resonates very well with how we, from an industry perspective, look at this. And I think it actually sets a, I would call it a clear, acceptable paradigm in the way in which Indian companies, Indian industry will deal with all of its stakeholders, not just in India, but also with all of its global, I would call it, linkages.
And you think the Indian industry, the diverse industry, is ready to sort of balance its aspirations for accelerated development and, of course, the green commitments that the nation has promised?
Yes, 100% yes, because the fact that we are human beings first and then we become companies. The second and most important point, which I mentioned earlier, and which is, I think, part of the G20 declaration as well, is to make sure that we can finance this growth in a sustainable manner. So you have the right trade-offs between what I would call as the climate requirements and also making sure that we have growth not affected, because they actually are not, I would call it, counter facts, and they need to be brought together to justify and make the future a good future.
The point about financing that you say is very critical. Climate financing, green financing, or where is the money going to come from, where is the investment going to come from to be able to make that switch to a greener way of life for developing countries, emerging countries is of particular concern. What are your thoughts on the strategies that we can adopt going forward? And I ask this question because a lot of promises of the developed countries that have not been fulfilled have had an impact. So now, how can the emerging economies, the global south in particular, can move forward on this?
I think there are two elements to it. I think one has already been actually covered in the G20 declaration, which is on the multilateral institutions and the way in which they're going to be structured and how they can actually access the ability to do that. And I think the report had been prepared very recently under the aegis of the under the finance minister. And I think if you look at it, I think that's the first step, because that then provides, I would call it, the platform for that to happen. Second, I think from a B20 perspective, we had also looked at whether there is an opportunity to create a pool of capital arising out of the current CSR model which India has developed in terms of making it a potential, I would call it, a seed fund to help attract further growth opportunity, further growth funds coming in. Third and the last important factor would be to make sure that we not just look at this as, developed countries funding, but actually industry and government coming together to make sure we are able to provide the financing for that. In fact, in the B20's address, the Honorable Prime Minister very clearly said that you look at this as an investment, or a reduction in profits as an investment for creating a better consumer who is going to consume more of our products in future.
Right. And if you talk about the best practices that took center stage at the G20, conversations around public digital infrastructure, and India has very successfully implemented many programs. What are your thoughts on the global implications and applications of India's digital transformation?
Actually, right now it's already happening if you look at it. And I think the fact of the matter is, including the developed countries, have understood that there could be what I would call as the best cost solution to make sure you have financial inclusion and digital inclusion for, I would call it, the broader population. And today, I think you see the success of it with the financial side. You see the success of it with the mechanism with which benefits are being passed on to people. And I believe this is the tip of, or the starting point of the journey which most of the global south will follow. And my view is this can also become a way of democratizing the digital infrastructure and the digital availability of data for the use of a larger benefit of a population by having this followed by other countries. Will this happen? I think it's part of the G20 declaration. Therefore, I believe the journey has started.
And many very potentially transformative alliances have also been spoken about. Global biofuel alliance is one such step moving forward. It seems very optimistic because it is taking care of the dependence on fossil fuels, at the same time energy security, especially for the emerging world. How do you see the scope of this alliance going forward?
Again, this is a very welcome step. And I think we have to also understand that, like I said, if you are going to make sure that you're meeting your climate mitigation goals, but at the same time do not have the challenge of sacrificing growth, we have to find not just one solution. We have to find many solutions. And I think the Biofuel Alliance is one more solution which can help address the gap, and help address the gap much faster without sacrificing the, I would call it, the opportunity for growth which the developing markets have. So therefore, it's a great move, and I think India joining it is a very important step, and making sure we create this as a future path to mitigate the climate issues which we face is something, again, we are very happy, and we will be very much participating as part of that.
And talking about milestone solutions, we also have this corridor that has been announced, India, Middle East, Europe. Connectivity is central to any conversation on development.
Yes, and that's why I said that's a very exciting development. And I think the advantage it brings is that the governments are committed to it, and therefore the private sector of all of these countries get an opportunity to participate. And this is a strategic corridor. And if you look at the two steps, which is the African Union integration and bringing that into G20, and this corridor between India, Middle East, and Europe, I think creates a big win-win opportunity for both private sector and governments to work together to create economic value and create prosperity for the entire humanity.
And also in the context of the competition that also comes in from our neighbor China as far as economic steps are concerned, this particular corridor is going to boost the opportunities for Indian players?
So again, like I mentioned earlier, if India wants to be part of global value chains, I think this is again a very important step in further strengthening that, and in a way creates, I would call it, an alternative attraction to make that happen faster, and not just in the context of China. But I think the way we should look at it is, I don't think it is one country versus the other. It is, as I think Honorable Prime Minister clearly pointed out, that there has to be trusted global value chains.
Absolutely. I also meant a connectivity program which sort of also takes into account sovereignty and international law. So the model of connectivity that we are talking about. Mr. Dinesh, one of the important aspects of the conversation also was the manner in which India focused on human-centric globalization, sort of a new model, more sensitive model of globalization. If indeed human priorities are at the center, and in economic terms, what kind of jobs, what kind of skill training, what kind of grooming are we talking about for the demographic advantage with the youth that we have?
So I think there are two elements to this. And I think for any economy to be successful, both have to go hand in hand. And what do I mean? The two factors are, one is that the maximum value is created by what I would call as livelihood businesses. They are the ones who actually don't bother about the return on capital employed, but they are the ones who actually make sure that the goods are delivered or the right services are made available in the right manner possible. And this is cutting across almost all global South countries, and especially so in India. So if I look at the kind of talent which is available there, make them digital ready, make them able to access the usage of technology in the best manner possible, and last but not the least, make their growth sustainable. So I think these are the three aspects where I see the focus on. The second side of it is then, how do they have the necessary skills? And obviously, even those who are employed in larger companies, do they have the necessary skills to harness that? I think that's very clearly, I don't think you need a separate action on it, because that anyway is a core focus for everybody, whether it's a private sector or the government, to make sure they are ready for it. Right. So if these two come together, I think you will have the perfect confluence.
Right, and this idea, engagement of human development, also has a gender aspect to it. Prime Minister talks about how women empowerment as an idea is not enough. We have to talk about women-led development. While our country is blessed to have many women leaders in a diverse field, but what can the industry do to sort of mainstream women-led development across all levels of functioning?
So I think there are three elements, and you're perfectly right. I mean, without, I would call it 50% of the country being fully involved and fully productive, we are not going to do that. And I think we also don't measure the some of the activities which happen from their productivity aspect of it, which actually reflect in the economic growth of the country and the economic growth of the various things which they are involved in from a women's side. But having said that, I think as industry, I think the focus has got to be to make sure that we provide them the right access to skill. And I don't think they lack the skill. It's just providing that immediate access, if I can use that, so that they can be fully got integrated into the mainstream. The second and the most important factor is to have women leaders who can actually become, so to say, the startup women. And they take the responsibility because they then actually create the role models for others to follow. And whether it is from CII side or as industry, I think that's something which is a core focus for us. And as we go through this journey, you will see definitely maybe India also taking a big step forward in setting the example for the other parts of the world to follow.
Right. Again, reflecting on the New Delhi Declaration, we talked about the achievements and the way forward. But what are the key headwinds going forward for global economy and for the vision that of inclusive development that India's presidency has presented?
I think there are three elements to it. And I think I started by saying that, I mean, making sure that we can finance the sustainability initiative and balance growth with it. And I think that's a point which again has come out in the G20 declaration itself, outlining the total amount of funding which is going to be required and seeing how that can be done in a better manner possible is the first important point. The second is that, as I mentioned, we have come out of a big pandemic and the crisis which followed. And today you have significant inflation taking place in the developed markets compared with even India. So while there is definitely a reduction in the rate of that happening today, I think that's something we will need to watch out for to make sure that that gets, because that does harm not just the lesser privilege, but also harms the market itself. So that's something. And I think the most important factor there I want to add is that just the use of interest rate moving up and down it becomes almost like a blunt tool, and therefore to find better methods of tackling that is something which we have to look at. The third and the last, which is I think a common factor, is that we need to have peace across the world and making sure that dialogues take place to find solutions which help the world evolve through this.
Right. You mentioned about the volatile situation faced by the global economy. At the same time, India continues to be a bright spot. After this very successful G20 presidency and the roadmap that the New Delhi Declaration presents, what are your thoughts on the manner in which India's stature in the world affairs, in economic affairs, has transformed?
I think it has really been visible in the last 2-3 years of the level of, I would call it attention, but most importantly, the way in which India's words or India's inputs are being listened to. But particularly so after the G20 declaration, and you heard all of the leaders speak about the fact that India had managed to put together a common declaration which sets not just the view for the rest of the world to follow, but how it can be inclusive. Therefore, I think India's stature is significantly made higher, not just from the point of view of visibility, but actually walking the talk, giving a path to implementation. And I think the Honorable Prime Minister has already said that there is going to be a follow-up virtual meeting taking place in November to judge the impact of these initiatives which have been announced and see how they can be implemented in a better manner possible.
Right. And finally, we see a new generation of entrepreneurs coming up in the country. Startups have made such an exceptional mark with the kind of vision, economic vision that India's G20 presidency has presented. What is the road ahead? Key takeaways for Indian young entrepreneurs who want to make a mark, not just in the country, but across the world? I
think that's started, if you look at it, even from the B20 aspect of it, because we had a startup 20, yes. And I think they work together to create, I would call it, the value for that. But I think, having said that, I think what this places is an opportunity, not just for the youth of the cities, but the people who are in different parts of the country to actually become wealth creators, to make sure that that wealth creation takes into account the fact that we need to sustain or provide for sustenance of the livelihood entrepreneurs, to provide for the lesser privileged in society. So any solution which brings a best, I would call it best cost solution for the lesser privilege of society should be the focus and can create opportunities for not just India, but for the rest of the world.
Right. On that note, Mr. Dinesh, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
And that was the President CII talking about the key takeaways of India's G20 presidency, the ambitious New Delhi declaration that sets a roadmap for inclusive and sustainable development. That brings us to the close of this edition of In Conversation. Namaskar.